And we do have Elliot Silver as our moderator. He is with Argentix Informatics. And our presenter with this session is Ewout Kramer of FHIR. He is the CTO and has been involved with FHIR standards since the beginning, nearly a decade now. He's a member of the FHIR core team and dedicates a lot of his working time towards furthering the FHIR standard, joining discussions with the FHIR community, not always in the virtual pubs, often on the chat.fhir.org. And he's also the visionary of the Simplifier.net platform. A quick footnote on Ewout as proof that he is a true Renaissance man. He is a runner, a cyclist, a swimmer, a classical piano player, and yes, one hell of a talker. So we will turn it over to Ewout.
Wow. Well, hello. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome. Thanks for sitting down with me. I had actually prepared a slide about who I am, but man, that was a lot of preparation. I don't have anything to add to it, I guess. Indeed, maybe most important for me is that I've been working a lot also on .NET API. And the resources that I'm going to talk about today are actually some of the more infrastructural ones. So there's always a lot of talk about things like observations and patience, and maybe even value sets. But today I wanted to refocus a little bit on some of the resources that get less press, so to say. These are the non-medical resources. They form the infrastructure core of FHIR. And what I'd like to do is go over them. So these are, you know, about 8 or 9-ish short stories about each of these resources that you see here. And what I will try to do is highlight some of the aspects you might miss if you just read the spec. And I'll focus a little bit on you being a server developer. So this is mostly from the viewpoint of someone who is writing a server. So with that being said, that's what I'm going to talk about. So if you think that's not what you came for, feel free to move on somewhere else. And otherwise, let's just get started with the first one, which is operation outcome. By the way, I've asked the moderators to collect questions because these are separate subjects. I've asked the moderator to collect questions if they are about, you know, such each of these single bullets, so we can have the questions immediately after each bullet, instead of you have to wait all the way to the end. Operation outcome then. So this is, I think, a really useful resource in the sense that I use it actually also within my software. So it's a collection of error warning or information messages that result from a system action. In the FHIR specification itself, we use it a lot where we need to return error messages from the usual FHIR RESTful interaction. So if you've been writing a server, implementing read or delete or update or any of those, you're probably aware of operation outcome. But I found it as a server writer, I found it really useful to use operation outcome almost everywhere in my software. So I basically based my internal error and logging structure on operation outcome. So it's easy for me to report operation outcomes. The FHIR.net API has support for it, and Vonk as well. The FHIR specification uses it for the RESTful interactions, but also operation outcomes can be returned as a result of a search. So within a bundle, so you're searching for something, and maybe you supplied the wrong search parameters or a wrong code or whatever. The server might return a search result, but also include operation outcomes in that bundle. That's not really clear from the FHIR specification, but that can still happen. There is a difference between operation outcome and detected issue. I've had that. That's a frequently asked question. What's detected? Detected issue is actually much more used for a clinical issue. So drug-drug interactions and these kind of things that you would communicate to a client with detected issue, whereas operation outcome is really infrastructural. We don't always use it. We don't use operation outcome just for errors. For example, if you call the validate operation in the against the server that implements validation. This is profile validation against an instance. The return type is actually an operation outcome. So we are using operation outcome within the spec also as a reusable type to return complex outcomes from functions. And you could do the same if you want to run a business rule and communicate back. It's not just for failures. It's really an outcome operation outcome. Let's take a look at operation outcome for a sec. As you can see, there are a few mandatory fields. So let's start at the top. First, we have issue here. So it's 1 to star. So you can't send an empty operation outcome. If you want to communicate an operation outcome, you have 1 to star issues. And as you can see, each issue has a 1-to-1 severity, so you have to supply the severity. And that's fatal error warning or information. And that's actually a required value set, as we say in the FHIR specification, which means you have to choose one of these options. We don't allow you to return anything else. So that's where you have to work with if you work with operation outcome. What's also not completely clear from the specification, I think, well, there is this code here, and this is a general category of errors. So again, this is a required binding, so you'll have to use the codes. And this is like a business rule went wrong, or this is not supported. So this is a quite high level error message and timeout. The actual details, so your own error codes would appear, your own error codes would appear under details. Details is a 0 to 1 codable concept. Now, codable concept can contain multiple codes and a human readable text. So this is an excellent place to have the one-liner error message and any number of internal error codes that you have. You might have your own modular codes, each part of your software producing 1 or more errors, and you could actually put them in operation outcome right there. And then this diagnostics, which is a string, and that's an excellent place for stack dumps, locals, debug output, and so on. So anything you need to diagnose what went wrong from the outside. And then this is an interesting thing. You see location and expression, and a location is marked with XD, which means it's already deprecated. So although operation outcome isn't young. I mean, it was there since the first version of FHIR, but location, we always had it as some informal kind of path to where, what is related to the error. Where did the error happen, for example, in the instance? And we formalized that into expression. So expression is actually a FHIR path statement that would point into the instance data, so you can say, this is where it went wrong. This is where it went wrong. So we had to abolish and deprecate location. So don't use that anymore. Use expression. Now, what could we do with operation outcome? The specification says that operation outcomes aren't actually there to be stored. So they are supposed to be transient and to be thrown away after you've communicated them. Still, I think it would be interesting if you had some kind of, see here, on the bottom, I simulated something like an admin endpoint. You'll see that example a few more times in my slides, where you say, if you go to this endpoint and you are authenticated, you can actually access a few more functions than normal users would. And here might be an operation outcome endpoint where you could just go and do a get and then search on maybe recent operation outcomes, more or less like a debug log. Although, because when we wrote the spec, we were so sure that we would never store these things, we didn't define any search parameters on them, which means that the only search parameters that are possible in operation outcome are the ones that are shared across all resources. So you can still sort on last updated, but that's about it. Still, I think keeping operation outcome as a internal way to communicate, store, and a debug log could be pretty useful. The official way, though, to communicate an operation outcome would be using AuditEvent. So that would be the next subject. Are there any questions about operation outcome so far?
Hi, we do have one, which is, why is operation outcome severity with code information used for successful validation when that code should, quote, have no relation to the degree of success of the action.
Should have, does it say somewhere like that in the spec that it should have no relationship? Let's take a look. Because that's exactly what we are doing, and that's exactly what the examples are doing as well, I think. If everything's okay, we return information. So I'm not exactly sure where that is said. Single issue assistant severity.
Reese, do you want to unmute yourself and clarify?
Sure, thanks. If you actually look at the value set on operation outcome that has a required binding, the definition of that code is where I got that quote from, and it says should have no relation to the outcome of the action.
Ah, yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
When
I first
so
saw
actually
that,
not saying,
yeah,
that is pretty. That's actually pretty weird.
So you can't get around it with your own code system.
Because I'm also pretty sure that if we look at the example here, example operation, there is a, let me see, general outcome was there.
I actually
Successful operation, see no issues. Yeah, number 3, all okay. Let's take a look what it says there, because see, code informational. So, oh, sorry, it's severity information and code informational. And so we're looking at severity here, weren't we?
Yeah, when I originally was looking at this resource, it seems like it's more like operation issues, because at least all of the severities should relate to errors or warnings, and informational shouldn't have to do with whether it passed successfully.
Right. I think most of the time we'll have, of course, also the 200 response somewhere, so we know it's successful. So that's probably why this is not as clear cut as we might want it to have, because we are clearly using it here, this information, to mark this as everything is okay, right? In the example, I think this is an interesting thing to put forward as a clarification in the specification, or we maybe should update the description over there. Do you know? Could you do that, or put it in the Q&A? We could bring it into the FHIR discussions.
Sure, I can do that, and I can open a tracker item.
All right, thanks.
Great, Ewout. So we also had a question of, that with location deprecated, how do you use expression with respect to non-FHIR input?
I think this is absolutely now the FHIR path elements related to the issue. So with non-FHIR input, you'd have to put that into the diagnostics.
Great. That's all we've got right now.
All right. Okay, audit event then. A record of an event made for the purposes of maintaining a security log. So this is used for, manipulation of data, people viewing data, access control, software startup and shutdown. And it's not provenance. The specification is pretty clear that provenance, sometimes it's close, but provenance is also less infrastructural. So audit event is really a system level security log, and provenance is more about who gathered which information when. So that you could also say there, for example, Mr. X was present when Mr. B made notes about this session, and provenance can also tell you that the information that can tell you that information was distilled from other information. So it's much more on the logical clinical collection side, whereas audit event is a system technical log. It is based on existing standards. The specification lists a whole list of them, like IHE ADNA. It's very broadly applicable because of all its, its codes, and it's a bit designed by committee. It looks like this. So generally, audit event, it consists of like the source, which is the system that actually creates the audit event, so it creates the events. And then there's these abstract things like agents, which is anyone or anything or any system involved in dealing with the operation that we're currently logging about. And entity is the information that that has been retrieved or whatever, depending on the kind of information that you log. As you see, it's pretty abstract. That makes, you know, that enables this thing to be, you know, manipulatable and ready to use in a broad number of use cases. But it also makes it pretty hard to use just in a basic sense. So I have here for you the minimum you need for logging a RESTful transaction, which is, you know, if you're trying to log the basic FHIR interactions. And so as you can see, the first one, type, subtype, they're extensible, but in this case, we're talking about REST operation and then read, vread, update, and so on. These codes are extensible. That's just what I'm saying. There's a broad range of use cases you can do. It's hardly limiting you in your possibilities. But if we're talking about doing the, you know, logging RESTful operations, this is how you could fill it out. And so the agent here is the only agent I have here is the user that is if a user is logged on and the app is dealing under those credentials, then you could log these as details. And entity is what is actually a FHIR reference data type pointing to the resource that has been retrieved. Now, I was talking about operation outcome before. Now, what if something went wrong? In that case, there is an outcome 8, which is yet another code signaling a serious failure in this case, and you would use that when you would normally also produce a 500 return code. And you will have a second entity if you want, if that's relevant, that points to an operation outcome. Now, since we're not supposed to store operation outcomes, this won't be really a URI, but probably a contained resource. So what you could do is keep a log of audit events, and those audit events that have an operation that you want to use to store an operation outcome in for debug logging purposes, you'd put that as a contained resource inside and reference the resource from here. So what I found surprising use cases, what I've seen is that people, you know, we get some kind of, with AuditEvent, we get some kind of standard exchange format for audit data. And some of my colleagues here in Amsterdam are training AI systems on top of this to detect possible fraudulent access. And it would be nice if this would enable some kind of market for these products with a standardized audit event. One thing, and this is the kind of detail that you might have missed easily, is that there is a period attribute in audit event, and you could use that to signal the beginning and the ending of your operation, and thus you could use that to do performance. To monitor performance, because you could use this log, look at this log, look at period, and see whether an operation took an exceptional amount of time. Also, do use purpose of event to distinguish between development, training, and production use. I'd like to go on to capability statement if I can. Let's see if we have time for or are there questions about audit event?
Yeah, no questions right now.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Hello?
Yeah, sure.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Hi, Ewout. So, question about auditing and in general about additional resources such as provenance. Is it the responsibility of a submitter to provide this event? So, for instance, I have my data load, some clinical data, right? Some resources of patient record. And am I responsible for creating a provenance per each resource and audit resources, or there must be some server capability that will automatically generate event resources per each submission? So who is actually responsible for doing this? Because I might, you know, skip the resource and not track by provenance or by audit any submission, or I have to build my client system to provide each additional resource per every resource. And in case of provenance, there kind of will be twice more resources, because I'll have one more resource per each resource, per each encounter, per each observation, per
Yep.
patient and so on. So it will be
Yep.
really,
Right. Right. So it's perfectly okay to use provenance as a client when you're sending data if you got something to report, right? There's one of the reasons we created provenance was that otherwise every single resource like observation, condition or whatever would have the same set of repeating items that V3 had about who was there, what was his role, and so on and so on. And to avoid that, we actually put all that stuff in provenance, so you could optionally provide that, because many times in many, as you say, in many use cases, you don't have the data and you don't want to send it. That being said, I think it's very probable that the system itself, based on the context that you're using the app in, will add this information based maybe on your logging information. You'll see many times that the provenance will refer to resources by version number. You probably know that you can reference to a specific version of a resource, and when you're putting that up to the server, you probably don't even know that version number yet, and the server will normally do that for you. So in those cases, it might actually refer to a specific version number. If that needs to be tracked. So yes, no, it's certainly possible that the server does that.
And same for audit events. So basically, I could just, for instance, if I expose an interface for submitting transaction bundles with data, right? I can, once I receive a transaction bundle to my system, I can create audit event resource to track every submission. And this is the purpose of the resource. So I'm kind of
absolutely
like tracking whatever I get. It's same I can do for get operations. If someone wants to fetch, I can create on every request an audit just to track that someone attempted to, get certain data, put there the query and some, meta information about the interaction. Okay, I got it.
Absolutely, 100% correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, Ewout. We've got one question here, but I think
I'd like to go on, I think.
Okay, excellent.
Yep. All right. Okay, capability statement. Let's see. This probably is a resource known by anyone who implemented the FHIR server, because you will have to publish a capability statement. What is maybe less known is that there's three kinds of capability statements. One is the instance capability statement, and that's the one that if you are a server writer, you have to publish under a metadata endpoint. So that describes an installed actual instance that you could reach out to. What is less known maybe is that there is a capability version of capability statements, which just describes say a possible product. So if you are, like our server Vonk or any of the other products, someone, maybe IHE, could create a repository of capability statements that describes the capabilities of each project or product. So you could look at the database and say, I need a server that supports X, Y, and Z, and give it to me. So that's the capability side of capability statements. And finally, there is a requirement side, which is actually used in implementation guides. Because that says, if you are compliant to this implementation guide, these are the requirements that your server have to, adhere to. So these are the things that you need to implement. So be aware that when you're working with capability statement, there are actually three kinds of capability statements. That being said, if you looked at capability statements, it's big, and you can see it's both green and yellow. And I do want to point out to you that that the yellow parts are still trial use and only the green parts are normative. I remember that about 2 months before going normative with capability statement, there was still a lot of discussions about whether we were going in the right direction with capability statements. The capability statement is something that people would like to keep on adding to. There's always another use case where you say, oh, I'd really like to add to capability statement, the way, whether I will allow searching on a single character, or whether I would, support security protocol X and Y. So we are in a phase where we're not sure that everything that you're seeing now in capability statement is the right direction. But we do know about this green part, so be aware that this might still change. Now, those of you who have implemented it know that it's a pretty complex resource itself already, but it also still refers to structure definition. I will talk about that one later, which specifies all kinds of profiles that your server supports. It refers to, actually, the structure definition itself looks simple here, but that consists of element definitions. Capability statement refers to search parameters as well, to list all the supported search parameters. It points to operation definitions, and so on and so on. What this boils down to is that if you do a get on a metadata endpoint, this is one I did on Vonk, and you can see that the size is almost 2 megabytes of data, just describing the capabilities of that server. Now, to keep that manageable, we have recently, well, quite recently, added a few features to the metadata endpoint that you might not be aware of, but that would be nice to add. One is get metadata mode normative. So we have a mode. So this will only list the normative parts of the spec. And the good thing, of course, is that the answer from this response would be backwards compatible because this only contains the normative things. Also, one reason the capability statement returned is huge is because you list the capabilities of a server for across all resource types. Now, what if you're only interested in the capabilities of a system doing patient? Well, you can do that with a subset query parameter or as specified here. Like with all resources, you can ask for a summary. The tricky bit is, and that probably you've seen as if you're a server developer, is that summary is actually defined on search. So if you're returning a search result, there is already an underscore summary parameter to say, I don't want a batch full of search results with all the fields, just return me the summary versions of it. Now we have copied and pasted that approach to the metadata endpoint as well. Metadata is not a search, but we still allow underscore summary. And that same is true for underscore elements. And so this is a very useful one where you go out to a server and say, I don't really care about the rest of the capability statement, just give me the FHIR version. Now, one of the surprising uses for capability statement would be as a service locator. And, you don't have to do that, but just to give you a sense of what you can do with capability statement as well. What if we used capability statement in a requirements mode? So this is saying, this is a capability statement that models a terminology server or a patient index. And we give this a fixed, known canonical URL. Then we could have a service registry, which is basically a FHIR server that maybe only serves capability statements, and it serves capability statements for each of these capabilities. So you actually can look up in the service registry and saying, I'd like to find the servers. So you have a server here that lists all the capability statements for each endpoint in your organization. So that capability statement is not only on the server itself, but also in this services registry. What you could then do is search, and there is a search parameter for that, search on that services registry endpoint for a capability that implements, where is that? That's implements here. That implements that capability statement, that requirement capability statement. So you're basically saying, give me all the capabilities, the implementation capabilities statements of the servers that implement my master patient index capability statement. And then if you look at the implementation part of that, you would actually see the URL. So this would be like a service locator within your enterprise where you can find out which of your servers currently is the master patient index, for example. I thought it was a surprising use for capability statement, one that we've discussed with Graham and Lloyd, but I don't think we actually put this somewhere in the standard. Questions about capability statement?
Sure, we've got one. How would you feel about a server returning a dynamic capability statement? For example, reflecting the permission of the calling user.
I know we've discussed that. Actually, I don't know the result of the discussion anymore. I seem to remember that we hadn't intended for that to happen, but I'm not sure anymore. So this would also be a good question to follow up on in Zulip, I think, where maybe Lloyd or Graham still or Josh still remembers the outcome of that discussion. I do know that this is not the first time it's come up. Sorry about that.
Great, thank you. That's it for now.
All right, search parameter. So search parameter is linked from capability statement and completely specifies, I might say, a search parameter that you can put on a get URL to a server. So it would specify what it looks like. Operation subject is XXX. It specifies which data actually is then being searched, and it also tells you what kind of search parameter it is. So whether you're looking for a token. This is all described actually on the search.html page. There, some search parameters can repeat, others cannot. All of that is described in the search parameter resource. Now, I'd like to point you out that and I'm using this in my implementation, that there is a full list of all the search parameters that are in core. And I use it to generate code in the .NET API, so you have the metadata for these searches at your fingertips, and our Fonk server reads these files to configure itself with search parameters. But it isn't completely obvious where you can find it, so you have to go to the resource page for search parameter, and then somewhere there, background and context, that section, there is this let's see if I can bring it there, registry of all search parameters. Now, if you click on that, you'll end up at a page that actually lists all of these search parameters. That's all of the search parameters from the core specification in one page. And you can see here it says you can download the XML and JSON for that page.
We do have 5 minutes, Ewout.
Okay. Right. And so what I'd like to do is take a look at these search parameters, what a file like that looks like. So, I'll just show it. Most of the search parameters are simple. They have a simple name. You can see here on the code. They're for a single search parameter. They're of type string, for example, so they search against a string. And the expression is a FHIR path expression here that would lead you to the path that you have to extract and store in your search index. Now, if you're doing this, if you're using this file to configure your server, you just have to watch out for the fact that there are some search parameters that, like _text, that have no FHIR path equivalent. You just have to know these, right? There's only a few. _text is a good example. And you also see that this one is valid for domain resource. So the trick here is that any resource that's a subclass of domain resource will have these search parameters. This is how we encode all these search parameters that are shared across resources. And it has no expression because this basically searches the narrative and there's no FHIR path expression for that. But most of them will have a FHIR path expression. Some, like clinical patient here, I just want to point you out, this is a bit confusing in the spec. We have ID, name, and code. The thing under code here is really the name you see on the URL. So this is the search parameter called patient. And as you can see, patient exists on a lot of resources, care plan, consent, detected issue, and so on. And for each of these resources, as you can see here, the FHIR path is a little bit different. So for allergy intolerance, it looks like this. For diagnostic reports, it looks slightly different. For observation, it looks different again. I'm showing you here the most complex case, but this is what you need to deal with if you're using this file as input for your server. Now, sure, there is a use for a search parameter endpoint. We have this on Vonk. You can upload new search parameters, and if you do that, we would they might come from an IG, a local IG with some new search parameters. And if you'd upload this, and in our case, I think you have to refresh the server or so. It will then start recognizing that search operation. I'd like to deal with basic for a second here. That I would love to do that. So the basic resource is used for handling concepts that are not yet defined in FHIR. And you could have missed that. So instead of saying, oh, now I can't communicate it, what you could do is use the basic resource. And you can see it doesn't have a lot of data. It has a subject and it has a code with an example binding that actually specifies what kind of resource this is, so you can make up one yourself. But importantly, this is actually meant to just extend upon. So here is a resource called, this is the basic resource, and I wanted to communicate a game result, so a score for a serious game, for example. And as you can see, this resource just has an extension, and below there, that is interesting though. Here is the code that actually says, this is a game result. So this identifies within the whole stream of basic resources what kind of resource this is. And the whole extension here contains the data that I would otherwise normally have in a resource. Now, of course, the intention is, and we've seen this already, that if this, if there's a real use case for such things, in the end, of course, HL7 will add a new FHIR resources to this spec. But that not being the case, you're not stuck in a corner. You can actually use BASIC to communicate it.
And we do have 1 minute left.
Well, structure definition, I have a lot of tutorials about structure definition. So let's take a look if there is anything else that is interesting. Well, I just want to point you out that another thing you can do and that other people do is create their own custom resources. As you probably know, the FHIR spec is distributed using structure definitions which exactly describe the resources. And you could add your own. And our Vonk server actually allows you to do that. So you could upload a new structure definition for a new resource type. And do I show that somewhere? Yeah, here. And then so you put to the admin interface a new structure definition, and after that, it actually supports your new resource. That's a kind of nifty idea if you're a server implementer. It has its limitations. As you can see here, for example, you won't be able to specify search parameters against it. But if you're already expanding beyond the spec, there's nothing from holding you back from expanding on you won't be standard, but at least you could communicate within your organization data on your FHIR server.
And Ewout, I do apologize. We are out of time.
That's okay.
So thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you, Elliot, for moderating. Please note that if there were questions that were not answered during this, the Q&A in Whova will be persistent. So Ewout and Elliot will be making sure that those do get answered.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much for attending. Check your agenda to get to your next meeting.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.